Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom.
And me, Rob.
Rob, it's been a busy January, but we're very much into February now. We've been a bit slow on these podcast uploads, but that's just how busy we've been throughout January. So hopefully a bit more rhyme and rhythm going into the year.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, look, it's been storm season as well here, hasn't it? That's interrupted recordings quite a lot. What have we had? Three named storms this month?
Three named storms. I couldn't name them.
And what feels like monsoon levels of rain in the month. Yeah,
we use that as an excuse anyway for why we've not been.
Yeah,
not been
exactly.
recording.
Well, it's a battle to get to the studio sometimes.
Well, it certainly is. But one day that we did manage to get to the studio was a couple of Fridays ago now.
Yeah.
When we held our first webinar of the year, and we were looking at the year ahead for CO2, and this was a really interesting and a timely conversation.
A less than stormy year ahead for CO2.
Yes,
as it's been for a couple of years actually.
Yes, and this is of course ahead of our CO2 summit in March, and it's great to have a very diverse panel in their expert areas, but great to cover off what 2026 has in store for these various areas for the CO2 market. So we had Stephen Harrison on. We also had Nippon Gases, Angelica Cortinovis of Nippon Gases, and we also spoke with our sponsor LogiCO2, didn't we?
We did indeed. I think one of the headlines that came out of it, in fact, for anyone that's been watching the Gasworld website, was that the CO2 business is now not at seasonal risk, but structural risk. And we dived into all different nuances, didn't we, around the future CO2 business and sourcing and supply and end use.
Absolutely. And that's why we're discussing this on the podcast today, because just after we came off air, we both said to each other, this would make a fantastic podcast episode, especially at this front end of the year as everyone's
we look ahead,
getting underway. So that's why we're discussing it here, and I think we should bring our listeners as much of that episode as possible.
We're going to start now by getting things up and running with Angelica. She began her career as process engineer in an engineering and manufacturing company specialised in turnkey CO2 recovery and liquefaction plants and biogas upgrading units installed all over the world. In over the next 24 years, she held increasingly responsible positions in project management, sales, business development, and in 2011, she was appointed general manager responsible for operations as well as commercial activities, management of business strategies, and the development of new markets.
Angelica then joined Nippon Gases Italy in 2022 as renewable energy business manager, and in 2025 took on the position of general manager of Nippon Gases Green Energy. Let's continue to set the scene of this webinar here, Angelica. As we start 2026, how does the CO2 market feel to you right now at Nippon Gases? Is it structurally tight rather than temporarily volatile? And what does that mean for how suppliers such as Nippon Gases plan its supply and capacity?
It's not about reacting to short-term volatility, but it's about redesigning our whole supply chain. That means a lot of things. It means diversifying sources, optimizing our production facilities for reliability and efficiency, but it is also about building cross-border flexibility to balance regional imbalances. When there are peak CO2 demands or seasons, maybe there are plant shutdowns and without the cross-border logistics and alternative sources, customers are likely to face shortages in supply. So structural tightness means supplier like us need to think long-term and not just react to short-term swings.
Sure, thanks, Angelica. So if we come now to two of the key themes that we outlined at the top of this webinar and that you just discussed in terms of security of supply and sustainability, how do you balance these challenges and what are the practical solutions that you see going forward through 2026?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, balancing security of supply and sustainability are just the two faces of the same coin. They are interconnected. You could not ignore one of the two without compromising the other one. So our approach combines several levels. Of course, we integrate biogenic CO2 in our supply streams, backing with the certification and food grade compliance to meet the food grade standards, of course. We are optimizing our network of plants all around Europe with shared KPIs and predictive maintenance to cut all the venting, improve efficiency and the energy use. And together, we work together with all our customers for solution for on-site recovery plans for local use of molecules to reduce the dependency on external supply. This for customers is a win-win situation because it limits or reduces the risk of shortages and reduce the scope 3 emissions, reducing also the transport cost.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And how has Nippon Gases diversified CO2 sourcing? And as we look forward, where do we see the biggest vulnerabilities today?
Well, diversification, of course, has to be the cornerstone of our strategy. Historically, for decades, the CO2 market relied on ammonia and ethanol plants production. And we have all realized that this is a model that is no longer sustainable because these sources are exposed to energy volatility and policy-driven shutdowns. So what are we doing to cope with this situation? We are building a portfolio that includes all renewable sources of CO2 from biogas upgrading and aerobic digestion and fermentation recovery, renewable streams that support anyway the sustainability targets. We are looking into the new sources of CO2 linked to e-fuel projects, which are the emerging part of the energy transition, looking for suitable raw gas streams. And yes, for us, natural CO2 coming from underground wells still play an important role because those sources provide predictable availability in the medium to long term. But diversification is not only about sources for us. It's about working and looking into our depth know-how in gas treatment technologies, which keeps our plant operating at the highest standards of efficiency and compliance. And here, of course, we benefit also from having HYSE take a part of our group, which is enhance our in-house engineering capabilities. And this means that we can integrate all the advanced purification and treatment solution across the network of our plants. And we can adapt quickly to the new challenges, the new sources, the new request of the customer need. What we also do is that we leverage cross-border transport to balance regionally imbalances, moving all that CO2 from one place to the other. Where we have more CO2 in one European nation, we move it to the other region where maybe there are lack of CO2. But it has to be considered that this requires investment, a lot of investment in cryogenic tanks and storage hubs and in digital planning tools to optimize routes, reduce downtime, and reduce the impact on the transport. Unfortunately, despite all our efforts and all the efforts within the supply chain, the vulnerabilities still remain. We cannot ignore that there is still a dependency on the sources. Ammonia and ethanol plants still dictate large volumes of the CO2 that is on the market. And With this plant's feedstock and energy disruption, it's hard. What also has to be considered is also that all these new sources coming out need to be need any way to produce CO2 that is according to our quality and standard levels, high quality and standard levels, and certification then adds also friction. The biogenic stream needs to be compliant and produce a molecule that is compliant to food grade use, and this takes times, cost, and also requires for us thinking out of the boxes, a lot of efforts in order to evaluate risks, which maybe were not there when the traditional sources were in place and when the supply chain was based on the traditional sources. And again, the infrastructure for long-range transport is under pressure. If energy spikes, if we have energy spikes somewhere in one European region, this can cascade into CO2 shortages elsewhere. So at the end, the diversification is not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process that requires collaboration, also with our customers, with regulators, and with the technology partners to build the resilience that is needed to serve this time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Angelica. A real great amount of context and considerations there. Finally, for the moment, I'm going to ask a question which I think is actually really important today because we've had this relative calm in the market. But as we look ahead to Gasworld CO2 Summit in Rotterdam in a couple of months' time and the rest of 2026, what is the biggest risk to the CO2 industry that customers may be underestimating today?
The risk, again, it is structural and not seasonal. It is the combined impact between the climate policies, the energy volatility, and the infrastructural gaps. Fossil CO2 is going to be reduced. CO2 coming from fossil fuel is going to be reduced and probably be phased out. But we have to consider that all that biogenic CO2, all those CCUs and storage and e-fuels projects won't scale overnight. And if you add to this context the geopolitical uncertainty and the transport bottlenecks, you have a risk profile that you cannot solve with a short-term contract. And we need to work together with our customers in terms of resilience, in terms of certification readiness, in quality standards, collaborative planning, and open cooperation between the suppliers and the customer. We need to rebuild the flexibility into the system altogether.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you once again, Angelica. Always great to have you on our webinar.
On to our next speaker now, and no matter what the state of the CO2 market, whether that be shortage, surplus, or anything in between, safety remains at the top of stakeholder priority lists.
It certainly does. And ahead of today's webinar, I spoke with Ross Olsen, Business Manager at LogiCO2, about the year ahead for CO2 safety. In Ross's role, he is actively involved in training and educating sales teams, installers and gas company personnel all over the world about the importance of keeping employees and customers safe.
Prior to joining LogiCO2 in 2024, Ross worked in the compressed gas industry for 11 years, from starting out delivering bulk CO2 and cylinders to designing and installing advanced CO2 enrichment and safety systems. He is continuously learning and advancing products. Ross earned a BS in engineering and worked as a contractor building highways, bridges and airports before getting into compressed gas and safety.
A great conversation that we had earlier this week, so let's listen into that. So Ross, thank you for joining me ahead of our CO2 webinar. And sadly, you can't join us live, so it's great to be able to speak with you now. On this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the year ahead in CO2. So to give us some context for that year ahead from your point of view, what significant changes have you seen in the CO2 market over the last 12 months?
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the opportunity to be here on GasWorld again. As far as the last 12 months for us, our scope of work is pretty narrow in the whole world of CO2. So, but what we do is safety systems, and we impact a lot of people. We do have some new safety initiatives coming up. We've been able to be a part of several expanding markets like wineries, the new CO2 refrigeration systems, and smart countries or smart buildings in developing countries. And for the year ahead, we see these initiatives continue to develop.
Sure. And how have CO2 monitoring and safety systems such as yours played a role in these developments?
One of the larger programs that we had for 2025 was in Central and South America. Absolutely fantastic countries, developing, and with this development and growth comes great responsibility. And we stepped in with the CO2 safety systems, and we found some great partners in countries like Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, and these great partners were helping keep people safe. And another big push that we did in 2025 at the end is in Australia. Australia had workplace exposure limits already in legislation, but they weren't being enforced. So we had a company reach out to us, and we went down, we did some fantastic training with this great group of people, and now we're helping them make sure that everything's in compliance. And many thanks to my colleague Christopher for helping do this.
Now, we know that CO2 as a refrigerant has moved from, I guess, an emerging alternative to that regulatory and operational norm, particularly here where I am in Europe. So how does this continue to evolve, and what countries have really been leading these switches and these evolutions?
Well, I have to give a great shout out to my colleague Petter in Sweden. He's really taken the lead on this. And you're right, it is all of the EU, and especially the Scandinavian countries where we're based in Sweden. The switch away from the F gases, the fluorinated gases that are used in regular refrigeration, F gases are quite harmful to the environment. And CO2 is easy to use as a refrigerant. It's a fantastic refrigerant. And as these larger supermarket chains and cold rooms and food freezing facilities switch to CO2, as a refrigerant, there needs to be some safety involved, and we're going to be with them every step of the way.
And as this switch continues and continues to expand, from a safety point of view, what are the biggest gaps that companies like LogiCO2 are going to need to plug?
As these refrigeration systems get bigger, the risk increases. There's a enormous facility in Guatemala that is, you could park a Zeppelin inside of it. And the amount of CO2 that is needed to keep that freezer cold is just enormous. And it's not just inside the freezer or cold room where the risk is. It's the mechanical room as well, where the compressor and the condensing unit's located. So you have to be able to have a CO2 sensor that's capable of extreme cold temperatures in the cold room, have that coupled with another CO2 sensor in the mechanical room working together, and have that signal or the alarms going to a central station so everybody knows the danger and everybody's aware of what's going on. And our priority is to keep people safe from the very first day that cold room is opened up.
Thanks, Ross. And what is it that makes these cold rooms that you mentioned and the freezers fundamentally different from other CO2 environments when it comes to safety equipment? Is it all about those low temperatures?
It is. I wrote down a response here. My response is they're bloody cold. CO2 sensors typically aren't designed to go to negative 40 C, and that's, freezing rooms get down that low. But our CO2 sensor that we designed for this, called the cold room, it is specifically designed to be in these cold environments all the time and still be accurate.
And to move on to another growth area now, and that's automation and data-centric decision-making. I think it's fair to say that the CO2 industry is way beyond, alarms on walls. So how is this growing world of data and automation shaping CO2 safety?
We've been doing this type of integration with data for quite a number of years, and there's two paths that we've been involved with. The first one is just collecting data and for employers to be able to report, exposure risks for employees. Say a bottling plant in Europe, if there's a CO2 exposure, they have to do reportings monthly to the government to make sure that employees aren't being overexposed. And the other avenue that we've worked in is connecting into building management systems. We've done this with a very large, well-known name across Canada. There's 1,500 stores that we have, and it's about real-time CO2 tracking, building management for efficiency, and just overall knowing what's going on.
And I suppose that's changing customer expectations and their attitudes too?
It is. Every manager in every business across the world has metrics that they're measured against. And CO2 exposure is becoming another matrix that managers are being held accountable for. So this building integration that we've seen is just if there's a slight CO2 leak, if there's a medium CO2 leak, it's being recorded and everybody knows what's going on. So did an employee accidentally leave a bag in the box empty overnight? We lost some CO2, the CO2 level went up. It's just making sure everybody is safe and holding people accountable for safety.
And looking forward, how would you expect this data that's been gathered to be used throughout 2026 and even further into the future?
What we've seen is real-time leak detection. You can see the CO2 levels in any given room where the CO2 is stored, a beer cooler, where you're dispensing the soda. One thing that we've also learned about is where I live in the US, first responders, like if I call 911, that first responder coming, if there's a CO2 leak, that's free to me. But in most countries across the world, that response of a first responder isn't free. You get charged for that. So if you do have a CO2 leak, you can see it immediately and you can respond quickly before you have to have the first responders arrive, saving money. Also, it's employee exposure reporting, very simple. We can go back in history and see the CO2 levels, what your employees have been exposed to. Streamline operations and saving money. CO2 is expensive and it's only going to get more expensive. So if you have a little bit of a leak, we can help detect that. If you have a bib left on overnight and you lose CO2, we can detect that. We can report that. And we also an all-inclusive CO2 dashboard that some CO2 companies are starting to create. So they can see CO2 level in the storage vessel. They can see the CO2 concentration and have it all integrated. Our CO2 sensors actually have a thermometer built in, and you can read that data and you can see, wait, is that beer cooler getting warm? Should we alert the customer and let them know that their beer cooler is getting warm? So it's very innovative and can be integrated to lots of different applications.
Sure. Now, one final topic I'd like to cover with you is education, which is, of course, a hugely important aspect of safety too. So how are LogiCO2 educating their customers?
Well, the best tool that I've found for helping customers is a one-on-one meeting with the salespeople and the technicians who actually install the equipment. We get to pull the cover off. We get to look at the guts inside the sensor and do the dip switches, different alarm levels, how all the functionality works. Hands-on training has been key for me. Now, granted, when you get a CO2 safety system from LogiCO2, it comes in a box. You can pull it out of the box and just plug it in. You know that you're going to be safe. But if you need something that's really innovative, we can do that as well. It's best favorite part of my job is the travel and the training. I absolutely love it.
Fantastic. And how is it that you're going to be continuing to do this in 2026?
We've got quite a few customer meetings lined up so far in 26, trade shows, conferences, and some more documentaries. We did some documentaries in Spain last year, one at a winery and one at a brewery. And we've got some more fun things in the pipeline. So we're excited to get real world installations out to the public so they can know how to keep people safe and how easy it is.
Thanks, Ross. And final question, if we take one final look at the year ahead, what would success look like for CO2 safety, both for LogiCO2 and indeed the wider industry?
Well, for us at LogiCO2, success is having a CO2 sensor next to any employee who has exposure to CO2, ensuring their safety. I want every employee to go to work, to know they're safe, and to be able to go home to their family every night. That's success to me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ross. Thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thanks to Ross Olsen there. Thanks to Tom. Great to get into that all-important topic of CO2 safety and education. And Ross's colleague, Christopher, of course, was one of the first GWGI award winners for his and the company's efforts in CO2 safety.
Yes, a deserved winner last month now, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Q2 is the next awards entries.
Yes, keep an eye out for that. But on to our third and final speaker of the day now, Stephen B. Harrison, founder and managing director at SBH4 GmbH. His work focuses on decarbonisation and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. E-fuels, hydrogen, ammonia and CCTUS are the fundamental pillars of his consulting practice. In support of the European Commission through SINIA in 2023 and 2025, Steve evaluated a total of 14 CCS, hydrogen and e-fuel submissions for the third Innovation Fund. Each year, the fund allocated €2 billion to large-scale decarbonisation projects in Europe.
Steve has served as the international expert and team leader for 3 ADB projects related to CCTUS and renewable hydrogen deployment in Pakistan, Palau, and Vietnam. He has also supported the IFC and World Bank on e-fuels and green hydrogen strategy development projects in Namibia and Pakistan. In 2021, he specified more than 2 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity for green hydrogen projects. With a background in industrial and specialty gases, including 27 years at BOC Gases, the BOC Group, and Linde Gas, Steve has deep knowledge of e-fuels, hydrogen, ammonia, and carbon dioxide, right the way through from commercial, technical, and operational perspectives. For 14 years, He was a global business leader in these FTSE 100 and DAX 30 companies.
He has extensive buy-side and sell-side, M&A due diligence and investment advisory experience in the energy and clean tech sectors. Private equity firms, investment fund managers and green tech startups are regular clients of his. He also supports operating companies in their mission to decarbonise their Scope 1, 2 and 3 GHG emissions. As a member of the H2View and Gasworld editorial advisory boards, Steve advises the direction for these international publications on e-fuels, CCTUS, clean energy and hydrogen matters. He's also served on the advisory board for the Hydrogen and CO2 Capture Technology World Expo at Hamburg in 2025 and again this year in 2026.
And of course, he's always ready to take our questions and are grilling on webinars. So Steve, welcome back to Gasworld Webinars. Now, at the top of this webinar, we highlighted the shifting sourcing models in the industry, highlighting that need for new CO2 sources. But these do, of course, need to be low cost commercially too. So Steve, you believe CO2 sourcing for commercial use will see a major transformation in 2026, which will follow through to the rest of this decade. Is that right?
Yes. As we heard previously, ammonia production has traditionally been one of the main sources of commercial CO2 because CO2 is captured within the ammonia synthesis process. So investment in CO2 liquefaction represents only a small additional operating and capital cost. However, CO2 shortages, as our first speaker references, are increasingly common during the summer months. At that time of year, demand for CO2 in chilled beverages spikes. Simultaneously, ammonia production falls after the spring, and corn ethanol, for example, production ceases off, awaiting the new harvest. Furthermore, ammonia plant closures by CF Fertilizers in the UK, BASF in Germany have removed some large commercial CO2 sources in Europe. Merchant CO2 supply and demand is finely balanced.
Great. And Steve, how do you see sourcing diversify away from ammonia?
In recent years, refinery steam methane reformers and biogas to biomethane upgrades have been used to diversify commercial CO2 sources. As an example, in 2016, 10 years ago, BOC started up a 50,000 tonne per year CO2 capture and liquefaction plant at Refining New Zealand's Marsden Point refinery. However, smaller local refineries are progressively closing as larger modern regional refineries come on stream. In line with this trend, the Marsden Point refinery closed in 2022, and the required refined products are now imported from other Asian refineries, Singapore and wherever else. Investments in CO2 capture and liquefaction from refinery SMRs will become increasingly risky.
So can we expect then that bioethanol will fill the gap that refineries and ammonia plants are leaving behind, perhaps?
For sure, it will help. Corn ethanol fermentation yields a high purity CO2 stream, which is readily liquefied. This is a common CO2 source in the United States. With wheat and sugar beet fermentation, CO2 from bioethanol is also used in Europe. For example, Mesa France has exploited a bioethanol CO2 source at Vertex Bioenergy at LAC. In Latin America and Asia, rice, sugarcane, and sorghum are the feedstocks of choice for bioethanol.
Sure, yeah. We've also seen a trend to use biogenic CO2 from biogas digesters. So what can you tell us about this?
Well, biogas to biomethane upgrades are done to ensure that the biomethane is of sufficient quality to be injected into the natural gas distribution and transmission pipeline network. CO2 needs to be removed to achieve a suitably high calorific value for the biomethane. So liquefaction of that captured biogenic CO2 is low cost again, because it requires minimal additional capex and opex. This biogenic CO2 has been used as a local diversified source of merchant CO2 in Western Europe. As some examples, Bright Renewables has installed food-grade liquid CO2 production plants at the biogas facilities at Hake and Brandis in Germany.
Fantastic. And I saw we had a question come in actually on biogas to biomethane and other options, but just here and now, is this trend to rely on biogas to biomethane upgrades a long-term sourcing option for that commercial CO2?
For the next few years, perhaps, but not much more than that. Biogenic CO2 is now prized for its ability to permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And there is now tremendous competition for biogas-derived CO2, driving up prices. Alternative CO2 sources must be found to enable industrial gases operators to serve their customers reliably and protect their merchant CO2 revenue streams.
And we'll get that biogas question to both Steve and Angelica in the Q&A. Yes, and that really goes back to what Angelica said with diversification not being a one-time fix and being an ongoing process and collaboration. So Steve, where do you see the big new competing outlets for biogenic CO2?
Well, since 2020, a vibrant voluntary carbon market has emerged. And the main buyers of so-called carbon dioxide removals credits or CDR certificates in the VCR, the voluntary carbon market, are cash-rich consulting firms and IT companies. And their vision is to offset the CO2 emissions from their business activities with these CDR carbon dioxide removal certificates. Considering that 370 euros per tonne must cover the full value chain cost and the cost of transportation and sequestration let's say from Germany is in the order of 170 euros per tonne. The willingness to pay for biogenic CO2 from a biogas facility is up to 200 euros per tonne. That 370 is effectively the price that CDR certificates are being sold at. So this is a new competing offtake that is pushing up the price of biogenic CO2 at those biogas upgrades, for example, to a level that is forcing merchant CO2 businesses to reconsider their sourcing options. It's not just about reliability, it's about price and competitiveness.
It is indeed, yeah, we need to get into those market realities. How can commercial CO2 sourcing diversify to supply the kind of volumes required for beers, soft drinks, food and industrial applications, and at affordable prices?
Well, for decades, commercial CO2 sourcing has been driven by economics and reliable supply availability, and it's pretty much fundamental, as we heard our first speaker say. Industrial gases operators have sought to access the lowest cost CO2 sources with minimal seasonality that can easily be purified to food and beverage grade CO2. This triad of drivers will remain relevant. But now that the biogenic CO2 market is being targeted for CDR, the most attractive merchant CO2 sources will shift to other industry sectors. And several sectors fit the requirements of merchant CO2 sourcing. But to avoid competition with CDR, my belief is that these will actually be geogenic and fossil CO2 sources. I don't see them being phased out. I see them expanding in the merchant market.
Sure, and that sounds great in theory, but can you bring the idea to life with some examples that we should watch out for in the real world?
Yeah, so CO2 capture is essential in ethylene oxide production to avoid an accumulation of CO2 in the reactor gas recycle loop. The gas captured from the process is rich in CO2, with water vapor being the main additional component. So much of the water vapor can be simply removed by cooling the gas stream to condense the humidity. The incondensable CO2 can then be fed directly to a liquefier.
And so to continue on that real world theme, Steve, and the actual commercials of this, the economics, is this what you've just discussed being done commercially anywhere around the world?
Yeah. Gulf Cryo, a leading industrial gases company in the GCC region, obtained CO2 from one of Kuwait petrochemical companies' EO plants in Kuwait's Shuaibah industrial area. This CO2 capture and liquefaction scheme was commissioned in October of 2014, with a capacity of 55,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. And following on from the Q8 project, Gulf Cryo implemented a similar scheme at the EO plant operated by Petrorabi in Saudi Arabia. And this plant came on stream in 2023 with an annual capacity of 100,000 tonnes of merchant liquid CO2 per year.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And do you have any examples of other low-hanging fruit similar to that?
Oh, yeah. Hong Kong's Taipo town gas plant, which commenced operations in 1986, producing hydrogen-rich town gas on 4 catalytic rich gas reformers. Town gas is distributed to, I think it's around about 2 million industrial, commercial and domestic users through a pipeline grid of 3,500 kilometers. Could you believe it? But CO2 is removed during that gasification reforming process so that the town gas has a high energy content so that it can be used for heating and cooking. And at present, the CO2 loaded gas stream is actually just emitted straight up to atmosphere. However, that flue gas stream could easily be dried and the remaining CO2 could be liquefied and utilized.
We do love a bit of town gas talk. We've done that a few times with Steve, haven't we? Okay, so like the ethylene oxide, we're looking at fossil fuel processing. Any other low-cost CO2 sources in this field, Steve?
Yep. Let's keep going. Natural gas processing, for example, converts raw natural gas to a usable commercial product, pure methane. When natural gas rises from the reservoir, the methane contains CO2, which must be removed for operational reasons. The costs of CO2 removal are borne by the natural gas processing to make pure methane natural gas. However, in most cases, that CO2 is vented straight up to the atmosphere. CO2 from natural gas processing has also been identified as a low-cost source of merchant CO2.
Sure, and again, this sounds good on paper, but in real life, is this commercially viable?
Yes. Liquide Australia and BOC in Australia recover CO2 from the Longford gas conditioning plant east of Melbourne. Liquide Australia started up their liquefier to produce food and beverage grade merchant CO2 in 2021, and BOC followed with a 60,000 tonne per year plant there in 2024.
Fantastic. And if you were a betting man, Steve, where would you put your money for the next wave of commercial CO2 sources from now until, say, the end of the next decade?
If I were a betting man, let me see. Well, waste to energy facilities incinerate municipal solid waste, MSW. And that MSW contains between 40 to 60% of biogenic material, paper, leather, wood, things like that. And those MSW facilities can only really monetize that biogenic fraction of their captured CO2 for CDR, for carbon dioxide removals, in that voluntary carbon market. But they will, if they're going to invest in capture facilities for that, they'll be keen to monetize the fossil fraction, the other 40%, 50%, 60%, to support the CO2 capture investment business case. So for my money, where's my bet going to go? That fossil CO2 fraction of waste to energy CO2 capture schemes will be a major opportunity for industrial gases companies to source low cost CO2 for their merchant businesses. And that's where I see the next frontier. That's where my big bet for the next wave of low cost, accessible, affordable commercial CO2 sources for 2026 and through to 2030 is going to be.
Sure. Hopefully someone in the office is taking bets on that.
I hope they are.
And Steve, I hear you've written an article for the February issue of Gasworld on this topic. I've seen it floating around the office, had a preview of it. So what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, indeed. And any subscribers to the magazine and the Gasworld website will be able to digest this information that we've been discussing today at their own pace to reflect on their sourcing and price negotiation strategies for 26.
And we know, of course, that at our European CO2 Summit in Rotterdam in March, only about 8 weeks away now, you'll be diving into this with a keynote, and you'll be as part of other sessions as well, Steve. So will everyone have a good chance to put their questions to you then?
Oh yeah, and I'm really looking forward to it. Looking forward to seeing you and the delegates and being part of the show. Yeah, my agenda item there, keynote speaker on morning of day 2, is really to share my insights and ideas with the conference delegates there, just like we're trying to do today. And hopefully after the presentation, we will have some time for some online and offline Q&A to drop into case-specific details that delegates might have. Of course, yeah, look forward to chatting with them.
Fantastic, and we look forward to welcoming you too, Steve. And as promised, it is time for that all-important audience Q&A. First up, Angelica, I'm going to come back to you with this first audience question that we've had from Bernd, who says, does Nippon Gases offer carbon capture as a service, potentially including the transport, and then gives the example of Northern Lights, utilising your existing CO2 vessels? And what's your view on the market potential of carbon capture and the utilisation as well as the storage?
Oh, that's a long question, and thanks for the question. Let's split it in two. In principle, I would reply yes. This is something that it is in our court. This is something that we have the know-how, we have the facilities, we have the hub, we know how to do it and how to plan it. In reality, first of all, we need to support our customers. So, as I said, cross-border transportations with all the plane closures around Europe, because I heard Stephen talking about really interesting potential sources, which let me think it back about my previous activities. But Europe is a peculiar country, peculiar continent if we look at these traditional sources. The climate regulation has been affecting the traditional manufacturing production, and has been affecting a lot the traditional sources of the CO2. So we're now moving, and some traditional sources of CO2 are not there anymore for us. So we're using the facilities and our technologies and our digitalization to support our customer and move the CO2 also where we do not have local CO2. So in principle, the reply to your question is yes. We're open to evaluate. We have been evaluating it with several of our partners. In reality, the customers are our priority for the moment. And I don't remember the second part of the question.
The second one was the view on the market potential of carbon capture as well as the utilization and storage as well.
Yeah, well, I've been on CO2 for a long time now, and I've seen this carbon capture getting on the news and being really interesting, and it's like a wave. The potential is there. Stephen was saying that it has to be a combination between economical feasibility, market acceptance, and regulation again. There is the potential. We will have to see in Europe how many of those CO2 capturing will be in place in the next few years.
Absolutely, certainly something worth keeping an eye on, isn't it?
Absolutely, thank you, Angelica. We got a question for Ross. Of course, Ross couldn't join us live for this webinar, but we will be sure to put that to him and the team post-webinar. So why don't we come to that question that I teased earlier. I'm going to put this to Steve and Angelica, actually, to get two different viewpoints. I'll come to you first, Steve. Kiel asks from Arda Energy, have we looked at biogas to hydrogen and CO2, which actually gives 2.5 times the amount of CO2 compared to biogas upgrade to biomethane? Kiel says this will give a LCOH of 3 to 5 euros per kilogram with the use of 5% of the electrical power per kg of hydrogen compared to electrolysis production. Steve, over to you.
Sounds like you should get him onto Gasworld TV and explain what he's talking about. Listen, I can't really comment on those kinds of numbers and figures there. It sounds like you've got a real expert or somebody who understands a lot about the technology that they've just proposed to you. It'd be best for them to talk about it themselves. I think if it's okay, instead of answering that question, I'll come back to the previous question if you don't mind. I think when we look at the scale of CO2 movements that we're going to be dealing with in the future for massive decarbonisation projects, it's going to be several orders of magnitude larger than the scale of CO2 distribution infrastructure that we've needed in Europe and globally to meet merchant market demands. And whilst I understand and completely agree that industrial gases companies have the competence to play here, the technical competence, and at present, we're basically moving stuff around in road trucks, right? Single road trucks. And the kind of scale that we need to be talking about to get involved in large industrial carbon management projects is trains with 30 trailers, 30 tank trailers, each one carrying as much as 2 road trucks, right? So effectively 60 road trucks moving on a train together, or in a ship. Your person asked about Northern Lights, which is all about shipping. And then when we say, okay, well, look, industrial gases companies have got a role to play here, I'm kind of going, yes, but where? Is it really just that last mile distribution on trucks, or are they going to engage much more widely? And if they're going to engage more widely, let's say in larger terminals, trains or ships for CO2 transportation logistics, then it's really going to be the kind of capital injection that we haven't seen come into this industry for years. Well, with the exception of some of the things that Seifi Ghasemi did with hydrogen in Jazan and NEOM. But I mean, I don't really think that this industry has got the appetite over the next 5 years to put that kind of capital on the table. So if the industrial gases companies are going to play in really large infrastructure scale CO2 investments, I think they're going to need to be very, very creative about where they find that capital. And the best example that I would throw to you and the listeners here, Rob and Tom, is if you look at what's happening with the data center industry, and specifically you look at Meta, right? So Meta, this is like the whole Facebook team, Mark Zuckerberg and whatever. And I think what they've done to scale up their AI infrastructure is something that the industrial gases world can learn from. So effectively, they know that they need to build up and own vertically integrate their AI infrastructure and build their own data centers, right? But instead of spending their own capital, what they're doing is they're getting a private equity company to basically pay for the data center that Meta will design, build, own, and operate, right? So Meta's got the technical expertise, just like industrial gases companies have got the technical expertise, and this massive private equity company's just got money coming out of their pockets is going to pay for it. And I think that when we think about scaling up industrial carbon management within the industrial gases sector, I think it's this kind of marriage that is really going to have to work, where we provide the technical competence, the insight, the safety, all of that kind of stuff, and somebody else puts a lot of money on the table. Because as I've talked about charm, this charm concept of leadership with industrial gases between now and the end of the decade. Capital discipline is absolutely at the top of the list. And if we're going to talk about capital discipline, there's no way that we can, move from a few trucks to these massive trains and ships for, massive scale CO2 infrastructure. I'd love to see it happen, but somebody's going to have to pay for it. And that's where I think partnership comes into play.
Yeah, well, just go back to your point, we also do have ships, and we move CO2 with ships from hubs from the mainland to UK, for example. But again, we are prioritizing our customers at the moment rather than all those storage projects that are around. And then all the pipelines, all the hubs require time, and as you said, require a lot of money and require planning in advance. And this is not something that it is easy to do at the moment with all the changes, the geopolitical situations. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And I was going to reference your recent thought leadership piece for Gasworld, Steve, and all that about capital discipline. So please do go and take a look at that. Take a look at that at gasworld.com. Kjell, it looks like we've got an invite for you to come join our next CO2 webinar to come and tell us more about that technology you referenced. Before we do just move on from that, Angelica, I never put that question to you. Are you or Nippon Gases looking at biogas to hydrogen and CO2? Is that a pathway you've explored?
Well, not really. It is not something I feel confident talking about technically, because I also do not know the technology, but I am really curious. I'm going to be looking into it.
Got something to pick away at then.
If we're simply reforming it as an alternative to reforming natural, fossil fuel natural gas, I mean, let's say methane, steam methane reforming, or any other type of reforming of natural gas, converting it to hydrogen, where the CO2 is produced during the reforming process. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, lots of people, Angelica mentioned HyCitech earlier on. HyCitech do a fantastic line in small steam methane reformers. You can feed them with, fossil methane or biomethane. I don't think they know the difference, do they, Angelica?
Yeah.
Bring it on. So I mean, I don't really know what your questioner is really talking about there, Rob, but when it comes to reforming of methane, I think Angelica and her team have got that under their belt.
Fantastic. Well, it's certainly a topic we'll have to dive back into, Tom.
Yes, Kjell, get in touch. Angelica, I'm going to come to you with a question that, Rob, you put to Steve earlier, but seems an appropriate one for you as well. But if you were a betting woman, where would you put your money for the next wave of commercial CO2 sources, or that next big CO2 source in the next decade?
Yeah, if it was me, I'm a lady of compromises. I have to go with Steve. Waste to energy.
Fantastic. You heard it here. Next question, Tom.
Yes, conscious of the time here. It's about that time that we start to wrap up. But this webinar is focusing on the year ahead for CO2. So if you both had a message for those people watching or listening to this conversation, or what to keep an eye on throughout 2026, what would that be? Steve, I'm going to come to you first on that.
Yeah, look out very carefully for how you're going to negotiate prices on biogenic CO2, specifically from biomethane to biogas upgrades. I think the biggest purchaser of those molecules right now is the Greensands project. This is the big INEOS sequestration project. They're basically buying up all of the biogenic CO2 they can find from biogas to biomethane upgrades in Northern Europe. So if that's one of your main sources and as industrial gases operator, think very carefully about when you're going to sign that contract, what price you're going to sign it at, whether you want to sign it at all for the kind of prices that people will be talking to you, and keep your eyes open for those new and emerging opportunities such as waste to energy.
Fantastic. And perhaps we can revisit that prediction at the end of this year. Steve, Angelica, how about you? What would be your message?
Yeah, the message again is work together with the expert on the CO2, because not everything that you hear on the news, on the paper, on the policy is going to be coming into reality really soon, and it's going to be real. So when negotiating the prices, don't shoot too high, don't expect too much, because or anyway, think real when thinking about either biogenic CO2 or promises of big plants, huge quantities, all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. Well, you've already alluded to it, Tom. Maybe we should invite Steve and Angelica back at the end of the year to see how those predictions fare.
Absolutely. Well, fantastic webinar that was, and great to relive it as well. Some great audience questions there too.
Yeah, and that's where it ended with the audience Q&A, then a little bit of an outro at the end of that webinar, but we just cut it there for the pod, didn't we?
Yeah, and we have so many more live webinars coming up this year. So if listeners like what they heard just then they should visit gasworld.tv, have a look at everything that we've got coming up, and maybe register for some that pique your interest. I'm sure we'll be revisiting the theme of CO2 or biogas over the course of this year, won't we?
Yeah, I think we will. I think we'll probably revisit CO2 in next week's episode, yeah.
Yeah, I would have thought so. But anyway, in the meantime, do please like, follow and share the 1895 podcast, and we'll be back again next week.